This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. We've got a news-making interview leading off this week's episode with the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations on the topic of Iran. All three interviews this week suggest ways popular conceptions can be shaped and altered or just plain wrong. NPR media reporter David Folkenflik explores the way Rupert Murdoch and his family and executives have shaped not just the media landscape, but the political landscape as well. And then Princeton University professor emeritus Mark Cohen discusses the surprises for so many in a new book, A History of Jewish-Muslim Relations. But first, he made headlines around the globe by sitting alongside Israel's defense minister through a presentation by Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif at a recent security conference in Munich. Many claim that by doing so, Israeli ambassador to the United Nations Ron Prosor and his colleague were presenting a new approach to the Israeli-Iranian relationship. Time magazine's headline from the event spoke to that theme, and in the sub-headline declared that their sitting down was, quote, an apparent warming of relations. Al Arabiya headlined its take by noting that Israelis and Iranians were, quote, face-to-face, and cited media reports from Israel and elsewhere suggesting this was a big deal and a shift in direction for Israel. But in our interview, the ambassador said there had been no warming of relations with Iran and that his staying in his seat at the Munich Security Conference should not be interpreted that way, and expressed repeatedly his skepticism and criticism of the new Iranian leadership regime, including Iranian President Hassan Rouhani. He also spoke to Israel's reaction to the change in status Palestine has seen at the United Nations in recent years. So you've just returned from the Munich Security Conference where international leaders gathered to discuss security. What is your sense of how the international environment is looking at security in Israel right now?
Well, it's quite obvious that the world is insecure. And most of the things that were dealt with were, of course, Iran, the Ukraine. And if you zoom out and you basically see that the violence all over the world has really become much more violent, and
in what sense?
And you see that it's not wars now in this, in the means like the First or Second World War, but you have much more violence, non-state actors, Hamas, Hezbollah. You have suicide bombers. You have interreligious and religious. What you see in Syria is a battlefield which is really a religious war between Shiites and Sunnites.
Within these fields of international diplomacy, the interaction between Israel and Iran, Israel and others, is closely watched. And in this specific case, it was noted particularly that you and your colleagues did not walk out when Foreign Minister Javad Zarif of Iran was speaking to the group, and to what degree do you think that reflects a change in attitude on your part, on their part, and what are we supposed to get from that?
I think the most interesting part in Munich was to hear the Foreign Minister of Iran, with a wonderful charm offensive and a smile, continue to say things that are basically outrageous. We, Iran, are against any foreign intervention in Syria, where it's obvious that this regime. I think the important thing for people to remember in everything that is debated is the character of the regime, what it does internally, while Rouhani isn't now in power. Hanging of people, gays, women, stoning of women, terrorist activities all over the region. And the Revolutionary Guards helping Bashar Assad butcher his own population every day. This is the character of the regime.
You're indicating a change in feeling on your part, on Israel's part.
There's no change in feeling. I mean,
not getting up and walking out like you would with Mahmoud.
First, the facts. When we were at the United Nations, we didn't walk out, we didn't come in.
But by and large, what I'm responding to is a sense in foreign policy coverage here in the U.S., in international coverage around the globe, in the Jerusalem Post and elsewhere, that there's, to some degree, a warming. Obviously, it might be still quite frigid, but somewhat warmer than it once was between Israel and Iran. But you're saying you're not meaning to communicate that at all.
From my point of view, it's really important on the Iranian issue to stress that the whole world is basically saying, look, why don't we move now towards Iran, because they all have certain interests out there. And we're saying, just a second, look at this regime. Look at what they're doing. Don't think in the, what you wish they would be doing. And the Iranians are amazing negotiators. They take every red line, They divide it into 10 pink lines, and they pass every pink line. Because only a pink line doesn't merit a response. Before you say Jack Robinson, they're way beyond the red line. And they have been breaching and lying for years on the whole issue of the nuclear program. And now it's obvious that everyone knows that they have there's no debate about that they're at least having a nuclear weapons program. Don't forget that in the past, people were still question mark that issue. So I would say the Iranians are not just carpet makers, they're carpet weavers, they're amazing negotiators, but we have to keep the eye on the ball, see where they are, and really test them on what they're doing and not what they're saying.
While Israel has a different take on its relationship with Iran than the media has reported, the approach taken by one media company is well known for its distinctive take on nearly all stories. Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, which is now split in two, not only shaped the news, but shaped politics and world events. And last year, as it was approaching the peak of its powers, it was brought low. The story of Murdoch's News Corp is told by NPR media reporter David Folkenflik in his book, Murdoch's World. What you've done in this book is profiled Rupert Murdoch and his rise to power and then his problems with power. And what you show is that, in part, as the phone hacking scandal we're now all familiar with was beginning to come out, the Murdoch empire was about to reach really the pinnacle of its power.
I think that's right. I think they were on the verge of obtaining approval from the government, led by Prime Minister David Cameron, to take over 100% of B-Sky B, the nation's largest private broadcaster, and a real powerhouse. At that time, really the leading force in televising sport in the UK and Britain. Something that added, well over, I think it was about $1.6 billion a year to the company's bottom line. That would have been a huge thing for them to take over 100%, a transaction worth $14 billion. And it's all cresting, just as you suggest, right at the moment that the hacking scandal becomes understood by the public. Well, Rupert Murdoch in the UK had about 40% of the national newspaper audience. He had the four highest selling newspapers in the country for, the highest daily in the Sun, the highest Sunday, the now closed News of the World, and he had two of the most prestigious in the Times of London and the Sunday Times.
And that meant nothing in the U.S. comes even close to that.
Nothing in the U.S. comes close. So there are two things to think about, one of which is the market share, 40% of the national newspaper market. And remember, Britain is a compact enough country that it really is a national newspaper market. They're going head to head. It's not here where you have different papers in Philly and Boston and Houston. It really was a national newspaper market. And the second thing is he was able to reach sort of what we're thought of as everyday working folks through the tabloids. And he was able to reach elites through those two leading elite papers, the Times of London and the Sunday Times. So he was influencing conversation on both the elite and the mass level.
One of the most revealing things that Rupert Murdoch ever said, I think, was a tweet he made last year regarding the Israeli the Israel war in Gaza, where he said that he was surprised that Jewish media owners were not doing more to be on Israel's side in this conflict. I think it said a lot about what he expects corporate ownership of media to produce in terms of the content.
There is sort of almost an affinity towards Judaism and towards Israel expressed by a lot of Murdoch's publications and outlets that are not necessarily reflected by an immersion in Jewish life of the top people running those institutions. He tends to favor Brits and Australians, most of whom are not Jewish, and that's fine. Right. That's totally fine. But there's a notion that he's going to tell Jewish journalists what to think or Jewish media executives what to think, which I think is at times it just amuses me. It's sort of misdirected. One of the interesting things about him having a Twitter feed is that, even when he's not calling the editors of his newspapers, they follow that Twitter feed really closely because it is a 140 character pure drip of what the big guy is thinking at any moment. I said to one of his executives, how is it that you let him do that? Because he's had to apologize so many times for things he said there or revealed things that his executives weren't ready to talk about yet. And what his aide said was, you be the one to tell him to stop doing it. We can't pry him away from the iPad. He's just going to say what he thinks.
Finally this week, perceptions can change our view not only of our present, but of our past as well. A new, very large book, A History of Jewish-Muslim Relations, suggests what we're getting wrong. And for Princeton University professor emeritus Mark Cohen, who edited the sections on the medieval era, these historical views are shaping events today. What you're doing, you edited largely the medieval section of this history of Jewish-Muslim relations. And right from the start, you say that what you're trying to do is bust some myths.
Right. Well, let me just say something about the origins of the book, the conception for the book, which was born in France, actually. The book was published initially in France by a publisher called Albin Michel, and they established a cooperative endeavor with Princeton University Press to publish the English version. And the purpose of the book, apart from simply being educative and informative, is also to improve the understanding of Jewish-Muslim relations historically and in the present. And there are myths about the Jewish-Muslim relationship. One of the well-known and common myths, which is a rather old one, which goes back at least to the 19th century, is that Jews and Muslims always lived in a kind of interfaith utopia. And the question is, what indeed is the reality of this relationship? And the fact is that it had its ups and downs, but by and large, especially when compared with Jewish life in the Ashkenazi world, in the Middle Ages, let alone in modern times, it was much better. What has happened in the Muslim world today is that it has taken on the characteristics of irrational anti-Semitism. The imported Christian European anti-Semitism, which came again on the heels of colonialism in the 19th century and then grew in intensity with the conflicts of nationalism, Arab nationalism versus Jewish nationalism, has become, I'm going to use the term, Islamized. Mm-hmm. That is to say, propagandists on the Muslim side are referring now to Muslim texts in the Quran and the Hadith, which is sort of like the Jewish Midrash, and they are quoting them in this context, so that Muslim anti-Semitism today looks as if it is rooted in the Quran and in the early classical literature. For instance, verses from the Quran that have been cited by Muslim propagandists today had very little impact on Jewish-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages. There's a famous verse where God, who is speaking to the Prophet Muhammad, and then Prophet Muhammad is speaking to the people, says that the Sabbath breakers, must mean the Jews, are to be punished because they broke the Sabbath. And God says, "You shall be apes and pigs." That particular theme occurs 3 times in the Quran. In one case, it refers to the people of the book in general. So in this verse, it refers to the Sabbath breakers. This has been appropriated in modern Muslim discourse as a kind of a signature verse.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast players. The Jewish Channel is available on cable, Time Warner Cable Channel 528, IO Optimum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, Cox Cable Channel 1, Frontier Communications, and on Comcast in the on-demand menu under premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.